So I think I can truly ask this here at 4 o'clock. I think this is the last session. So why are we here? And why do we do what we do? There are a lot of high-sounding words, and Agassi and a bunch of people who really do care about education. Betsy DeVos believes in education, and all the people who protested DeVos believe in education. We are all trying to make the world better, and we all disagree as to what that means. It's time to put some rigor behind those words. And there are 3 areas to discuss, and I really mean discuss. Please feel free, as I'm walking through this, to bring in questions and comments, and let's make it a discussion. We've all been here. I'm still hungover. I maybe speak just for myself. The first issue is measurement. What's a good school? What's a good intervention? What's a good degree completion program? And whose job is it to make and perfect those metrics? There are 3 metrics that might surprise you, even those of you here who are pretty sophisticated. The first one is, I once correlated union strength to NAEP scores on a state basis. A lot of us believe that unions are the problem, and so I said, well, let's put some numbers behind that. And the answer, of course, is that union strength is measured by Fordham, correlates to NAEP scores, actually 0.1 positive. Unions tend to improve education. When you regress out spending and percent free and reduced lunch, that correlation basically goes to 0. Whatever the problem is and whatever the issues between us and unions are, there's not a ton of statistical evidence that they are the problem. I think we have a management problem, not a labor problem. That's just me, but if you've got numbers that are better than those, I'd love to hear them. The second is the charter movement was dealt a blow in Massachusetts this year. We lost our efforts to raise the cap in Massachusetts, largely because people were convinced by the unions and others that the growth of charters hurts district schools. So I did the math with my friends at NAPCS, where I'm on the board. It turns out that if you look over the past 20 years at which districts have a lot of charters, and then you look at their change in NAEP scores during that time, that there is a 0.3 correlation positive. The deeper the penetration of charters, the better that the district schools did. And by the way, the charter schools outperformed the district schools, so the better that the city overall did. The data is going to be we're continuing to refine it and tighten it up, but again, we have these data-free debates. That's a data point that I think is interesting. And finally, everybody talking about the disastrous rise in college costs. Some of you do know that the cost of higher ed has been flat for 10 or 15 years, flat to inflation. That the reason people believe that college is getting more expensive is that colleges are price segmenting. Every year, they raise their tuition by 4% and raise their financial aid accordingly for less advantaged kids. They're simply charging differential pricing like airlines. But instead of talking about the lowest price seat, they're talking about the most expensive seat. I should note that that's the cost of college. Thank you so much. The price of college has changed for that reason, and also reduced subsidies by states. They used to pay 75% of the cost of public school. Now they pay 25%. But to some degree, we have less of a cost problem and more of a how do we pay for it problem. So I have 3 kind of just directional things to discuss when it comes to measurement. The first one is everyone in this room and pretty much everyone in the country agrees on what the point of K-12 schools are and how to measure them. All right, what are we trying to do and how do we measure it to see if it's a good school or bad school? And what we would all agree to is this. Over the next 30 years, the kids coming out of this school are going to be employed, They're going to be engaged with that employment. They're going to be happy overall with it. They're going to be happy citizens. They'll vote. They won't go to prison. They'll be engaged with their community in a bunch of ways that we can measure. And they'll be healthy and happy in their personal lives as well. Low obesity, low suicide rates, low alcoholism, right? If we have a school district turning out kids who thrive in that way, and again, as the economy changes, as the world changes, they're able to navigate those changes, that must have been a hell of a school system. We don't measure any of that. Or we have the measurements in little places. We don't pull it together to say if we're doing a good or bad job at all. We measure things like test scores with some faith that they correlate to those long-term outcomes, but with actually no evidence at all. The reason that people don't believe our measures, the reason that people will lay down in front of the bulldozer when we're trying to close the worst school in a city, or protest against charters when they clearly are outperforming and by widening margins, is that nobody believes our metrics. And that's our fault because our metrics are terrible. Number two, the way we look at after-school programs and other interventions and degree completion initiatives is pretty brain dead as well. There's an easy measure. What does it cost for this nonprofit or for-profit to create one additional college grad? Right? And it's actually not that hard to measure it, and if you want to be more nuanced, you can look at which college and look at the average earnings of students at that college versus the average earnings of college dropouts versus the average earnings of people who never went. And you can start actually computing ROI in a pretty straightforward way for a whole bunch of programs that are pretty different from one another, interventions that are in middle school or high school or in college. And we don't do that. And so we all support our favorite organization trying to do degree completion or trying to get more kids of color, more disadvantaged kids through college, and we do so on faith. And the third thought is that who should be funding this? Who should be thinking about how do we measure these things that are obviously would be really good to measure and not ridiculously expensive? And my proposal is that this administration is not likely to do that, and that the organizations themselves are already stretched thin and are probably unlikely to put the money behind it to measure these things in a precise way. This is probably a job for a nonprofit, for a philanthropy, to focus on this issue and to fund organizations to do the math, to follow their students and publish the number, whatever the metric we come up with as part of what they do, as part of their practice. We have to create the expectation that if we're going to give money to an organization in education, that it measures itself in a way that anybody cares about. By the way, I've done some research on this, and I've also aggregated a lot of other research. You go to the head of accountability, and a lot of us know heads of accountability for states, and you give them this ream of paper that they've produced, and you say, so which school should I send my kid to? And you get the dull stare, followed by, well, it depends. I don't know. I don't know your kid. Right? So all this data, all these billions of dollars we're spending on accountability, when it comes to powering choice, does a pretty piss-poor job. On the other hand, when you talk to parents and you say, well, where should you send your kid? They do all kinds of crazy stuff. Like, there really is a not great track record of choice of parents making the right decisions for their kids. And we shake our heads and say, well, we can't trust parents to make those decisions because they make bad ones, when we're giving them virtually no information. When you ask a parent, I have 2 schools that we could send your son to. This one, 37, a kid like your son, not some average kid, but a kid with his kind of grades and background. When he goes to this school, he has a 37% chance of graduating college and a 5% chance of ending up in prison. When he goes to this school, he has an 18% chance of graduating college and a 10% chance of going to prison. 100% of parents get it. It's an easy decision. We don't have terrible consumers. We have terrible data and terrible ways of getting them information, and then terrible ways of turning that information into decisions. And all of this matters because the marketplace itself that we all live in is so opaque and so inefficient. And we wonder why it's hard to sell education, why education companies grow so slowly, why investors here have to be so patient, and this is why. Because the information we have in this marketplace is really lame. Finally, about money and the social impact of EdTech. Money is the 800-pound gorilla of education. Number one, just your separate orgs. Are you helping to lower the cost of great education? So there are two movements that have done that. MOOCs, we can lower the cost of education by getting rid of the professors and getting rid of faculty-student engagement. And there's a whole lot of data that says the point of higher education is faculty-student engagement, Gallup numbers and other people's. This seems like an odd approach. Further, my analysis is that probably about 20% of the cost of higher ed is teaching faculty. So I'm not sure that going after that 20% solves the problem, either economically or in terms of quality. The second movement has been the movement to unbundled degrees. We don't really need college degrees anymore. They're antediluvian. Despite the continuing gap, the widening gap between college-educated and non-college educated students. There is no data that says that people survive in 2017 better if they don't have a college degree. All of us are sending our kids to college, and yet there's this kind of belief floating around Silicon Valley and elsewhere that that's all behind us now. Oh, the economy's different now. It's all different now. Show me the data. So the people who are not addressing cost, number one, the OPMs. A student in a 2U program is going to spend $20,000 in loan repayments to cover 2U's profit. The notion that universities over the next decade or two are going to spend 2/3 of tuition revenue on marketing and on some support in tech is ridiculous. And we know it, and yet there is a real rush. There are 45 OPMs and counting. Kaplan just turned itself into an OPM for Purdue. That was effectively what happened. And this is an odd moment, and we have to think about what are our approaches to higher ed, what are our partnerships with higher ed that actually lower the cost without screwing it up. Similarly, when you look at private equity firms in education, the playbook often is we buy the company, lever it up, raise the price, and juice sales so that we can take the bottom line up by 10% a year for 5 years, sell the company to the next guy. PE-backed companies just keep raising their prices, and I'm not sure that even though we believe we're in this industry, we're at this conference because we're making the world better, I'm not sure we're looking hard enough, I'm not sure we're measuring hard enough. You all know my feelings and many of your feelings about the for-profits. They spend, many of them, 3 times as much on marketing as they do on teaching. And they recruit students who have no chance of graduating. And those abuses are fading, but they're not gone. And I would expect over these 4 years to see some of that come back. And it's something that we as a community have to police and have to call out. How we measure things matters. What we put up with matters, because we're not going to get help from someplace else. This is the community that has to measure and commit to that. There are 3 groups in education. The first group believes that things are fine. They don't like any of us. They're not entirely wrong. We can complain all we want about how our K-12 schools are terrible, how we're number 20-odd in PISA. When you look at those numbers and you regress out percent in poverty, we look a lot better. We don't look great, but we look a lot better. Our higher ed system is still our crown jewel. It's also our 5th largest service export. Everything is imperfect, but everybody who's worked in a restaurant will tell you they piss in the soup. In every industry, there are problems. It's not clear to me that the justification for all of it is that education is a disaster, is a train wreck, is something that we need to save. It is. There are real problems, and we should be solving them. But we've got to give that group their due. It's not quite as bad as some of you might talk about. The second group believes in marketplaces. I'm obviously in that group. How we measure things, how we inform decisions is critical. And the continuing perfection of the metrics, the continuing effort to help people make smarter decisions will drive this industry and will drive education in a really positive way. Your kid's school might be right for my kid and might be wrong for my kid, and that's okay. The third group, because of everything I've talked about, has stopped believing in choice at all. They want reform. They've given up that parents will make good decisions, that schools will choose the right curricula, that colleges will choose the right tech. And instead they go for a one-size-fits-all marketplace, a one-size-fits-all universe. Common Core, state testing, No Child Left Behind are really martial law. They really are saying, I know what everybody should learn. I know what your kid should learn, and your kid, it's all the same thing. And I pretty much know how to teach it, I know how to measure it, and that's what we should do. And they're aware that that's not really right. Anybody with 2 kids knows that's wrong, anybody with a sibling. But they're so mistrustful of markets for really good reasons that they've kind of gone down that road. And that's a disastrous road as far as I'm concerned. It's a deeply unpopular road as far as parents are concerned and educators. But it is the alternative school reform effort. And if we don't do markets, that's what we'll get. Obviously, I'm pretty focused on marketplaces. This is what I do in my nonprofit work and in my for-profit work. It's what Noodle's about. It's pretty unsexy work, and it's a little bit lonely. That first group of traditional reformers, they're not big fans of trying to perfect markets because they'd like us all to go away. The third group of top-down people are dismissive of it, and the people who believe in markets largely are free market fundamentalists and just believe if we give choices, it'll all work out. The metrics don't have to be very good. The market doesn't have to be very transparent. The good stuff will rise to the top, despite a lot of evidence in a lot of markets that that's not quite how it works. So I invite you to join the crusade. This is the critical issue of this moment in education reform and in the growth of this edtech sector. And with that, I'd love questions and comments.
Okay, so I live in San Jose, and I have a really good friend who sits on the board of the County Board of Education. And I asked him once how many school districts there were in the city of San Jose. There are 16 school districts. So, what I would submit to you is one of the problems, and I think it goes all the way up to, so then, you go to the UC system and you find out that Janet Napolitano was squirreled away $178 million and is paying her administrators all this money. So I think the problem is that, most of us have seen, so I'm a banker, so I can see that the most inefficient organizations are top-down pyramids where, the bulk is at the top. I think the real problem overall is that you've got way too many administrators and who are not really producers versus way too few teachers who are in effect the producers. And quite frankly, if you live in Santa Clara County, I think what you would hope for is one district where they're taking away all these administrators, paying teachers better and leveling the playing field in whatever neighborhood you live in. So that's my comment. My question to you is that having listened to Betsy DeVos yesterday, I was somewhat confused by, she was talking about that every state is diverse, and I think I got the idea that she doesn't want the federal government to be involved at all and wants each state to decide, what science is, what math standards there are, what civics are. Can you comment about? I mean, did you listen to her speech?
Yep.
How did that? I mean, I found it kind of scary, to be honest with you.
There are a couple comments. The first one is we are spending double on K-12 education versus 20 or 30 years ago. The average teacher's salary has gone up like 2 points relative to inflation. None of that money's reached those teachers. I don't think it's necessarily either in higher ed or K-12. I don't think that is necessarily because people are just getting more and more bloated bureaucracy. I think we're putting more and more demands on our schools and our universities. This is a trickier problem than that. But I am intrigued by the alt schools model and the other models that basically take all of the back-end services from private schools in that case, move them offshore, move them centralized, and so the only people in the building are educators. I think there are some interesting lessons that we might learn there. In terms of national standards versus state standards, I think they're both moronic. Like, there's no state in which everybody's the same. There's no country in which everyone's the same. There's no city in which everyone's the same. The notion of choice really starts from, in most places, not every place, but certainly in all cities, there are different schools. And what does this school bring to the table for my kid? What does she want to learn? Where is she right now? And who's going to bring her best to a good place? And the notion of a monoculture, whether it is for a large city or state or the federal government, is problematic. So I'm actually with the Secretary on the role of the federal government on national standards. I just think that giving it to the states is not a hell of a lot better.
Hi,
Yes, daughter?
John. I would love for you to make some predictions around what ISAs are going to do to the market, income sharing agreements, and if there needs to be any regulations around it. Where is the role of this? What do you think the future looks like for income sharing agreements?
So Nicolette the other day referred to me as like a father to her, which pretty much killed me. The question of how we share data, how we move students, how we move credits, is a classic example of people who don't get markets. The people who say every college should accept everybody else's credits, for instance, really? Like, college is simply a collection of courses. Your course is my course. It's all the same thing. Kind of misses the point. On the other hand, the average student switching majors loses like a semester's worth of credits. The average student switching schools loses a full year. We've got to do better in terms of transparency about what you can and cannot do, and subtle market pressures to encourage schools to take more of each other's students, to share more in other ways. An example of this in another way is curricular materials. So the MOOC concept reached its sort of zenith with the test of giving a Stanford course to San Jose students, San Jose State students, turning, the notion that we can have one Econ 101 course and turn every other professor into basically a TA. And it didn't work out for a lot of reasons, some of which were just political. So on the one hand, we kind of reject the notion that a professor should have absolutely no say in what he does. We applaud the ability of a good professor to figure out who his audience is and to bring them and what his interests are and his or her narrative arc, and bring students through that arc. On the other hand, think about a textbook. No professor, no teacher ever starts a course at page 1 and ends on the last page and just walks all the way through it. A textbook is a toolbox. When we create online courses, we're not thinking of them as toolboxes, we're thinking of them as the course. When you start thinking about modules and a marketplace of modules, and your Econ 101 course that you're putting together is pulling this and this, and there, somebody did a brilliant supply and demand curve widget, and I'm going to pull that, and somebody else did this, and I'm going to pull that, and somebody else put together a course, and his kids are a lot like mine, I'm going to take that and tweak it. The opportunities for collaboration among universities through content, not at a course level, but at a module level, I think are extraordinary in terms of driving down cost. Good instructional materials for a college course costs $50,000+ plus release time for the faculty, let's call it $60,000, $70,000 all in, and then another $10,000+ a year forever to maintain it. That's not inexpensive. If you're taking that expense and putting it over 50 kids, you got a big problem. But if the modules that make it up can be reused and end up being used for 1,000 kids a year, materials become a rounding error. They're just not a problem at all. You don't have to have them used for all students, but what are the opportunities to create materials at a module level and share them just enough that we can drive down the cost here? Sorry, rambling answer. Was that? Well, I'm out of time. Thank you very much. I hope your conference was great.